welcome to Course of Action. I have an outstanding guest today, Jerome Preisler, author of Tom Clancy's Net Force Moving Target series of books. The newest one is Moving Target. And Jerome, welcome. Thank you for coming.
I've been looking forward to this. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And thank you for the books. I got a couple of them mailed to me. I'm reading through one of them, and then I'm going to give them away to some veterans because
Okay.
there's a lot of really cool veterans out there that I know. I'm a veteran myself, and uh,
Um,
I like to give, when I get books, I like to read through them, give the authors a good review, and then I like to share them with fellow veterans. So thank you very much for the autograph copies.
you're very welcome. My pleasure.
So let's talk about first. Let's talk about you. You're a native to New York and Maine, right?
Yeah, grew up in New York, lived in New York for most of my life, and I've had a place in Maine for a while. In the last few years, it's become more or less our base.
Okay. And how did you get really into publishing? I know that you've got a lot of other books outside of the Tom Clancy Net Force universe, but how did you kind of get into publishing initially?
Oh boy, it's such a convoluted story, and I don't even know where to really begin. I guess I'd been writing since I was a kid and really never thought of it as a possible career or thought of it as anything but. In other words, I wasn't looking to do anything but write. And there were times in my life when I didn't. There were long stretches when I let it go. And then probably in the early 90s, I really picked it up. And um, I was writing for a lot of men's magazines, which I saw as the only opening for me at the time. I really felt like a total publishing outsider. I didn't know the ropes. I didn't know anything, anyone. I just didn't know how to go about actually becoming someone who was a published book author.
Right.
And this guy that was the art director for uh, a bunch of magazines I was working for came in one day to the office one day, and by art director I mean he was the art director, he was the art staff, he was the guy who did the whole thing.
Yeah, everybody.
And he kind of stumbled in and he said, there was a publisher at the time. I think they've been defunct for a while, called Leisure Books, and back then they were a leading independent publisher of genre fiction, horror, westerns, action adventure, all of that. And he said, "Listen, there's a new editor. He just came in. I know him. He used to do biker magazines. So why don't you go talk to him?" And that was kind of interesting because um, what he meant by that was he wouldn't look down his nose at me,
Hmm.
um, and he understood that I was trying to keep my head above water writing and writing whatever I could. So anyway, I had a meeting with him. I walked out of his office with a deal to write a horror novel.
Okay.
It wasn't for much, but it was a book deal. Now I was terrified because I'd never written. I wrote a book when I was 11 years old, but that's a different thing. Now I have to write a book that there are expectations here, and I just did it, and there were a lot of things that happened in between, and uh, ultimately I just moved along from there. I started writing an action series for Berkeley Books, and that led to some other stuff that I did for them. And it was through Berkeley, which was Tom Clancy's publisher and still is, that I eventually made the connection with Tom Clancy. In that, and there were, I'm really giving you a very abbreviated version. There were a lot of ups, downs, and twists and turns in between, but that's kind of the short version.
So, how many books did you write before you really kind of got into Tom Clancy universe?
Oh boy. I'm gonna say probably about 10.
Okay.
Yeah, close to 10.
In different genres?
Yeah, I did two horror novels. They were actually supernatural Stephen King type horror novels. That was the genre I thought I was gonna stick to. And then I did a series I did a series called Swamp Master as Jake Spencer, and that was a post Snook Mad Max type action adventure
Okay.
series. And then I did. I think the next thing I did was I did some TV, what they call TV tie-ins. There was a series called Homicide: Life on the Street, which was actually a fantastic series about these detectives in Baltimore. One of the best series of the era and to me of all time. And I was very fortunate to be offered that. So I did several books in that series, a bunch of other stuff. Um, and Then I did, my first work with with the Tom Clancy franchise was actually there was a kind of a there was an emergency situation in a project in a Clancy project, and I was asked to come in, and I can't be too specific, but and do some work for it, and they were really happy with that, and that eventually led in around 1997 or 98 to my being asked to do the POWERPLAYS series, which was co-created by Tom Clancy, and I did that for close to 10 years.
Wow. Wow. 10 years in that. And then so you knew Tom.
Yeah, I mean, it was strictly on a professional basis, but yeah, I was one of I'm very privileged to have been one of two or three writers who actually worked with him during his lifetime. Um,
Yeah, you and Mark Greaney and I can't think
well,
of it.
actually, it was at the time it was myself, of course. Larry Bonds did Red Storm Rising, but actually it was myself. It was a guy named Jeff Rovin who did Op Center, and there was another guy who was writing Net Force, the original Net Force series,
Okay.
because the series I'm doing is a relaunch,
Oh, okay.
and so we were at the time. I think it was that was it,
Hmm.
and then I think
Yeah,
Mark
later
Green,
on in the early 2000s, I think
yeah, yeah,
later 2000s, something like that. Yeah, Mark
yeah,
came on. Wow, so you knew him before he passed away and had
yeah,
worked with him a little bit before that.
yeah.
What was it like? What was it like getting introduced to that? It being so legendary already. Even before he, passed away. What was it like being introduced to that universe? Were the demands different? Yeah, what was it kind of like?
That's a good question. It was scary. I can remember, as I sit here, and you asked the question, I remember very distinctly. I got the Power Plays series of novels started out as you may know, Tom was onto into gaming very early on, and he had conceived of a video game called Power Plays, and it was going to be a series of games on different subjects. And initially, it was going to be a political role playing game, and the first book or the first game was to be called Politica. There wasn't going to be a novel. I was first approached to do a kind of nonfiction companion piece, almost like a Lonely Planet's video guide to accompany the video game, so people could know what the politics in Russia were and the different locales and all of that.
Mm.
And I thought that was going to be it. And I was happy to do it because it was work and it was working with Tom, but it wasn't actually my thing because I was really considered myself a novelist. And so we talked about that, and then everybody involved said, "Okay, we'll get back to you in about a month or whatever." I just waited. I remember there was a wait, and I got a call one morning at 9 o'clock or in the morning, and it was by this guy Marty Greenberg, who was instrumental in pulling together all these collaborative deals with Tom and other authors at the time. And he said, "Are you ready to do a series of novels?" And I was like, "Huh?" And he's like, uh, we're not doing the guide thing. It's going to be a series of novels, and I want you to know that I remember his words were." Multi-million dollar franchise is going to rest on your shoulders.
Yeah, no pressure.
9 a.m. And I remember, so are you, but it's a great opportunity, Jerome. Well, no kidding. Um, so, are you in and what can you say? You're not going to say no.
Yeah, no.
But I remember hanging up the phone and being really frightened. Um, but it ended up, it's like it's kind of like what they say with baseball players, and it's the same game whether you're in the minor leagues or you're in the majors, and they tell every rookie, your first game at Yankee Stadium, just remember it's it's just more people watching you, but it's the same game, and really that was how it was for me. And everybody I worked with from Tom on down was so professional and supportive, and I really didn't feel that when I once I got into the actual writing, I didn't feel the pressure. It was, it's at times, it's when the book's about to come out, it's when you turn in the book, are they going to like it? But when you're doing the work for all those months, um, it was like any other. It really became like any other project that I'd done.
Do they have a lot of parameters or things that you had to meet and expectations that maybe were outside the norm um, because of the world that Tom had built? And did they kind of have different standards that they wanted you to kind of stick to?
Well, that's also a good question. Nobody ever sat and kind of laid these things out for me. I remember, I remember if it was Tom or somebody else said short scenes, and I said, "Well, I already do short scenes." So, okay, great. And then, what I knew was that obviously with the Tom Clancy book, when you're all the technical stuff, anything that you're doing in terms of your research, whether it's geopolitical or military, all of your research has to be right, and the information in the book has to be spot on, because that was a real hallmark of Tom Clancy.
Oh yeah,
Um,
very strong military, very accurate. You know,
yeah,
like that was what people knew him by.
yeah, and so I knew that. I mean, I kind of nobody really had to tell me that. I knew going in
Hmm.
that I had to kind of meet that standard. Um, there, Tom, especially early on with some of the, uh, Patriot Games, Hunt for Red October, those books, they were really, those first books were really, they weren't as long as the others, and they were really character driven.
Hmm.
Jack Ryan's family, his wife, uh, um, and I really liked that. So I felt that sort of played into my strengths, because I thought that I was uh, pretty good at characters and really layered characterizations. So I think that my strengths kind of matched, but I knew that I just had to be good, and nobody really actually said that, but the expectation,
Oh yeah.
you understand it. it it's just, when somebody tells you you're going to do a Tom Clancy series.
Yeah. It's time to
Yeah.
step your game up a little. Like you gotta rise to the occasion. So, how did that change your research? Like when it came to digging into the subject matter and the plot, and then saying, "Okay, I gotta really research and do my due diligence because of kind of that standard bar that's so high."
I made a lot more calls and tried to make a lot more personal contacts. Um, Being here in Maine when I was writing a lot of those books, at the time we had the Brunswick Air and Naval Station here, and which I believe is mentioned in Hunt for Red October, I think. Um, and I was fortunate in that I happened to know some of the I knew a high-ranking retired officer there, so he was able to gain me entree into all of that, and I became more. The more people I spoke to, I just established more of a network of military people I could call to help vet me on things. That was something I really didn't do before. Before that, it was primarily doing the research in using books or magazines. And of course, you use things like Jane's Defense and all that stuff, but you have to become a little bit more hands-on, a little bit more conversant. Um, and it really became, uh, I think now that we discuss it, it comes to me that I became a really good researcher. I developed just by doing it all the time. It became one of the things I one of the things I was good at doing. And years later, when I started doing nonfiction, um, that was obviously a great tool to have at my disposal. So I think that was it. I think it was just that again. It was just expanding and being a lot more careful and broader in my research because when you're talking you're researching politics, you're researching everything, you know. So
Yeah, so I know I've been trying to work on some fiction, and I know that doing research and then applying it to storyline are kind of two different things because you might find some facts and some things that work, but you got to make them work for your storyline, and then of course you got to make it feel realistic too. It can't feel like it was just placed in there. Um,
yeah.
it's got to add to the larger picture. But what was it like when you first took on the Net Force series and you said, okay, here's kind of where it's kind of a reboot, as you said, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you wrote the first one, which was Dark Web, right?
Right.
So when you wrote Dark Web, what was kind of the thought process behind this? Saying, okay, I'm relaunching this. This is going to be the first one out the gates. Um, what was kind of your thought process behind that, and then knowing that it would turn into a series and that you'd have to have multiple afterwards?
Well, this actually was very different than say Power Plays because I went to the the Clancy estate with the proposal. I saw as some time had passed, I'd actually discussed doing a a reboot back in 2013 that sort of it just never really happened and came together, and NetForce was just dormant. And around 2017, as we started seeing a lot more about the internet, cyber this, cyber that in the news, I became more and more convinced that it was the time for this series. I really thought that it had found its slot in time. So I wrote up a proposal, a rather lengthy and detailed proposal, and I'd had some preliminary discussions. And one of the things that I had to really consider was that the original Net Force series, which was written roughly from say 90 mid 90s, let's just say through mid 2000 to 2005, something like that, maybe a little bit later. Um, it was set in a future world of at the time 2010 or 2011. So here I am now picking up Net Force in 2017, 7 years after that future world passed. So there's a bit of a dilemma. And so the most reasonable way to do it was to do that relaunch, to do
Yeah.
that reboot, and kind of look at the what the found what were the what were the what was the core concept, what were the foundations of the Net Force series, and keep what I could, which was a lot, but really keep it true to what the concept was, but bring it into our, I was about to say our current day, but I actually said it slightly in the future, not quite as far as the
Hmm.
original. I'm just 2 or 3 years in our future,
Yeah.
but so it was a different experience in the sense that I, I done a lot, obviously 10 years worth of power plays, a lot of stuff in between, and I'd had a lot more experience. So I wasn't, there were no nervous jitters or anything like that. It was really a question of, and Tom sadly was gone. So I think it was a question of how do I do this? How do I stay true to what Tom would like, to the spirit of a Tom Clancy series, and yet make it new and fresh. So I guess what I'm saying is it was more kind of looking at it from uh, 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 the perspective of crafting something from the ground up, as opposed to coming into something that had already been really set up,
Yeah.
laid out for me.
You got a fantastic blurb from Mark Cameron when it came to Dark Web. And he said, a tightly woven, expertly crafted story with a finger on the pulse of the overwhelmingly clear and present danger of cyber terrorism.
Yeah,
That was
I
from
was
Mark Cameron regarding Dark Web.
yes, I was extremely grateful for that one.
Yeah, he nailed it, and yeah, I noticed as I've been reading through Moving Target, yeah, just a couple years in the future. I think Moving Target is in like 2024 that 2025
Yeah,
range. So it's not quite out there so futuristic that it's unreachable, but it's right there, kind of like this could actually happen, and I think it's really awesome. Let's talk about Moving Target now. I'm going to read kind of the synopsis off of Amazon here. And NetForce Moving Target is a new battle is brewing on one that will soon rage across all political and geographical lines. As this new threat escalates, the U.S. president calls on the members of NetForce to prevent global chaos. In Paris, the leader of a new political movement has gone into hiding, pursued by a relentless group of bioenhanced assassins. Seeking to rescue him in the mysterious catacombs beneath the city is one of the Net Force's own Callie Alcazar, who has become a hunted fugitive herself. Halfway across Europe, meanwhile, her friends are about to strike at the heavily armed fortress of the world's most dangerous hacker, and he's prepared a deadly trap for them. Which sounds absolutely like a Clancy book. I mean, it just sounds like there's so much going on, but it all makes so much sense. And um, how did the idea for NetForce kind of come to fruition, and what kind of research did you do behind the catacombs in Paris?
well, I had uh, many years ago I'd actually gone there, but um, what you can see of the catacombs is, I think it comes to like a mile and a half, um, and the actual network of tunnels beneath Paris is uh, about 200 miles, twisted like like many pretzels.
Yeah.
Uh, so the question that I asked myself is, what are those other, 198 and a half miles? What are they like? And it's not as if nobody goes there. There are, as I started to research a little bit, I started reading a lot of stuff that was written by people who call themselves cataphiles, Catapiles, and they are essentially, there's a whole subculture in Paris of people who um, have all these little secret ways of getting down there, and many of these entrances are in uh, abandoned rail stations and they're covered up by false rocks and false bricks, and they have there are groups that have uh, um, raves down there. There, there's also there are artists who have carved out sculptures down there. So so this whole strange world opened up to me, and yet there's still so much of it that nobody's been through, that's still walled off. So I just started doing all the research on that, and it's funny because I initially had thought that the catacombs would be probably the first 40 pages of the book, and it's goes throughout the whole, whatever it is, 500 pages of the book now, or close to it, because the world kept opening up to me. Um, so that was kind of the process, and I, as happens, I tend to do a lot of the research as I move along. So if I start thinking of what might be a cool action scene, or some interesting scenario, I'll start researching more and see how I can accomplish it. Generally not if, because I figure, well, I'm going to find a way to pull this off, but it's how do I do this?
So how do you really dig into the cyber terrorism and the hacking side of kind of the storyline and the research? Because something I've noticed that I've kind of dug into it is like it is a very very deep hole to go down, and it seems to be the minute you find out something and learn it, it's old.
Yeah,
So how do you write something futuristic and keep up with technology that seems to be constantly outdating itself?
you know, uh, uh, again, it's a really good question. And what I, how, when they say objects in the rearview mirror closer than they seem, or closer than they look.
Mm-hmm.
Well, objects in the future are also, and when you're talking about cyber technology, are also, I found, a lot closer than they seem. So it's again, I the first stuff I did when I did dark web, I actually um, had, I forget how this occurred, but I'd met someone who was an FBI liaison to writers, people who were doing movies, and through a series of phone calls was put on to somebody in FBI cyber in New York.
Okay.
And I had a few lengthy conversations with this one agent, and he he left he left an open door so that I could contact him if I had any questions. So that would come up as the first book, especially, and even a little bit with the second book. Um, and then after that, it was kind of the same process. It was that we're talking about with power plays, except whereas that was more in terms of weapons and military technology, here it was just kind of asking, making a few contacts, talking to people. I talked to um, I met someone who was uh, designing into designing firewalls, and she kind of started telling me how essentially what you just said, how as soon as you've got a you've plugged a hole in it, there's eight more open up.
Yeah.
And um, so that gave me a feel for it. I had that, and it was kind of the same thing. It was just really starting to know a few people, talk to people. That's really how it goes.
So, what did you find maybe the most intriguing about writing this Net Force series when it came to the cyber terrorism and the hacking stuff that really made you go, "Whoa, that's real"? Like anything that just kind of triggered you, may go, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, I've gone too far."
I remember having lunch with my editor and my agent uh, after I signed to do the series, and we were just talking and tossing ideas around, and I mention a few things neural about neural networks and also biohacking and the kind of interface between artificial intelligence and human intelligence and how that might be evolving and what was going on with this stuff. And I think I'd read at that point I had read this white paper that was by either the Department of Defense or the Army. I forget which now, but it was about actually how a combat unit would function with neural implants. And this is something that money had that I knew back in 2000, or rather 2017, 2018. I suddenly realized, wow, there's serious funding and serious research being done
This is
on this
not
stuff. And
futuristic movie stuff. This is real.
yeah, and so I discussed that with my editor, and I was like, well, how far do I go? Like if I find out something is being researched, but I don't really know how far along they are because they may say it's 10 years until the fruition of a computer chip implant in the brain. But in fact, if you really look at it, you realize that they're a lot further along. But
Hmm.
how do I do this? And we kind of just came up with, he said to me, if you're reading about it in a reputable news source, if you're seeing stuff about it in the Times and then in scientific journals, then go ahead,
Yeah.
just run with it. And it was interesting because in when I wrote the second book in the series, Attack Protocol, I really started looking at neural networks, and in that story, um, a an entire fleets of uh, kamikaze drones are hacked and sent against our heroes. And I have these really intense action scenarios where the drones are just coming from everywhere, and it takes place in a lot of the book takes place in Romania, and part of it in an imaginary castle in Romania, which is the uh, lair of this master hacker. And I don't want to give away the whole story, but I've got all these really sophisticated drones just coming down on the place in one scene. And I remember after the book came out, I got a few emails going, this really seems like this is Marvel Comics MCU stuff.
Yeah. Far
And,
fetched.
yeah, and then look at what's obviously that was what 2 years ago, and look at what's happening in the Ukraine, and
Hmm.
it's it, in fact, I look at it now and I think, wow, because I even worried after a while. When I was writing, I thought, am I too far ahead? Is all this stuff gonna happen by such and such a year? And here I'm actually a little bit behind the curve
Yeah, it's
because
like
you
the
know,
movies of the late 80s and into the 1990s that were so far fetched, that were very, you know, futuristic. Even later than that, going back all the way to like Star Wars, that all that stuff seems so far fetched. Well, now Elon Musk is trying to colonate Mars, and he's got a Neuralink that he's working on, and medical technology is caught up, and now we can't even stay caught up with modern day computer, technology, and when it comes to hacking and cyber defense and terrorism. And they say, the next great world war won't even be fought with bullets and bombs. It'll be fought over the net because there's way more that can be attacked online than there is that can be attacked in person. Like there's going to be no need for ground troops because you can shut off entire, regions of a country's electricity and water and emergency services with the click of a button, and it's way more devastating long term. So it's like those things that seem far fetched are not really that far fetched anymore. Like you said, there's real funding behind looking into some of these things, and that's what you could find out. Think about all the black programs and classified programs that the DoD and the three-letter agencies don't even have public information about. You know, it's not even public knowledge. Nobody knows about it. It's like it's kind of scary.
Yeah, and you know what I found was in writing Moving Target, um, I started thinking a lot about AI. Actually, I began really weaving that into the mix um, a lot with the second and third books, and with an eye toward having some of those storylines come to fruition in Moving Target. And I, I started looking into, you know, trying to see where are we in terms of AI. And of course, you know, uh, you have the Russians have developed their own military tetracomputer that they're developing uh, as a really a, a hub for their for all of their military activities. Which is to say that it's, if you remember the old movie War Games, it's
Yep.
the real version of that. It's where all of this data is going to be integrated in integrated by the single entity that has a tremendous amount of wargaming capacity, and also that will be the first alert. So envision this supercomputer um, taking in a whole lot of data and thinking, "Wow, this is a major threat to Russia," um, and alerting the Air Force, the Navy, the Army.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and of course, the United States has its own version of that, and other countries are developing their own. And then, you know, just recently, I don't know if you were reading the story in the New York Times about the uh, Sydney, Microsoft chatbot. Have you,
I've
are you
seen some
aware
of
of-
the Chat GDP or whatever it's called, and some other ones that are just kind of like people are really using them, but they're becoming like self-aware and they're making like some really weird recommendations. And I was like, what is this all about?
there was a story, and it's interesting because it really again dovetails with something I did in Moving Target, because I do have something like that occur with an artificial intelligence. And what happened was a tech writer, I believe, for the New York Times started talking to uh, the AI chatbot for that Microsoft is developing, and they call it Sydney. And internally, I don't know if it has a name like Alexa, but
Yeah.
that's what, you know, scientists, engineers are calling it. And he got into, and right now it's in beta, and only a few people have really accessed it. And he got into uh, a 2 hour conversation with it. Just to kind of frame this, about a week before, I had read an article that he'd written saying Bing is going to be, which is the Microsoft version of Google, that's going to be the real search engine of the future, powered by this AI, because the AI is so conversant and so able to you know, you can say to it, well, what do you think would be a great new lawnmower for me, and it'll just give you a bunch of lawnmowers. And after, well, what you know, what sort of lawn do you have, and where do you, it's, that sort of thing. So he really recommended it, and then he got into this 2 hour conversation with it, and it was so disturbing to him that he couldn't sleep that night. And they published the entire transcript, which I read, of the conversation, and it starts out very, you know, he's asking for information, but it suddenly takes this dark turn. And once it takes the plunge, there's no pulling it back. The writer at times tries to pull the AI back to, well, but can you recommend the lawnmower? And the AI is telling him, "I love you," and starts to tell him that, and he says to the AI, "Well, I'm a married man," and the AI starts telling him, "Yeah, but you're not happily married." And
Becoming manipulating?
becomes extremely manipulative.
Wow.
It's like saying, you're bored with. Yeah, I'm paraphrasing, but you're bored in your marriage, and I can do this, and it was creepy, and
Yeah.
so
Sounds. Well, this
it,
is
it
how
really is.
Skynet and the Terminator started. Like,
It truly is. And then, so you have these two schools of thought where you have, and then here, what gets me is you have these Google people saying, well, we just have to put more constraints on it. This is why it's beta. And, but isn't that every nightmare when the noggins say, yeah, we're going to put more constraints on it, but that it's already out of the barn by the time
yeah,
they say that.
don't worry. We'll rein it back in. Well, I just tried to rein it back in the conversation and it refused. Well, how are
Yeah.
you going to do that? Like, wow.
And then and there's a real question of what is true self-awareness when you know and a lot of people will say that well, what it's really trying to do, it's really mimicking human thought processes. It has access to virtually unlimited data. It's got access to every word that's on the internet. It has access to every book ever written. That's not an exaggeration. It has all of that pouring into it. And unlike the human mind, which is kind of on a single stream at a time, we're lucky if we can think in two streams.
Mm-hmm.
It can think in an infinite number of streams. So um, but the question becomes, uh, is it mimicking human behavior and human thought, or is it self-aware? Is it what they call the point of technological singularity, which is when it becomes it's out of control. It's its own entity. And the truth of the matter is that when you start talking to a lot of the experts, they'll say we don't know. In fact, the true answer is nobody knows. Nobody knows when it's really becomes self-aware, and when it's at the cusp of it.
That's
And
scary.
it's
It's scary.
it's scary stuff. It's really scary stuff, and it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
it
and
really is.
so,
It's super fascinating because you just think about it and go, oh, I remember in the Marvel movies and Tony Stark had that, Jarvis AI that he just talked to casually and he would insult it and it would insult him back and it would suggest something and, it had a life of its own. And it was like, oh, that's pretty funny. What if that was real? Nobody
yeah,
thinks of like, yeah, the fun part of it's real, but like the real scary thing is everything is so digital now that it has access to it. So an AI has access to literally everything and so much faster and more accessible than what I can. I got to go on there and I got to research, I got to Google, I got to find things. It can filter through them in real time and then provide a
instantaneous.
real time answer. I mean,
Yeah,
that's horribly scary. Like I'm a kind of a firm believer that sometimes there's things that just shouldn't be, created. And this
uh,
might be one of those things. Like if movies taught us absolutely nothing, is that it could become self-aware and do things. And yes, Skynet and the Terminator all sounded, futuristic back then. Well, it's real. We
yeah,
got robots and stuff that can climb and jump and do work, and then now you're gonna put AI into them.
yeah. You
Scary
know,
stuff.
in Moving Target, I have the bad guys. There are groups of bad guys who are culled from groups like the Wagner Group and others. They're all mercenaries, but they've undergone something called in the series I call it the Blood Lightning, which is they've been biohacked, or they've or bioenhanced, and they have these neural computers. And you mentioned Elon Musk, and he's developing these neural fibers, and is fairly well along on that. And so uh, I've actually started thinking now, and so I use that a lot. So all these guys, I did a lot. I used a lot of the DoD research in terms of how these groups, these units, um, which are essentially special forces units, would interact using all linked with little computers in their brains. And so that was one level. But I'm actually now starting to think, well, as I'm getting more and more into researching AI, I'm thinking, well, what happens if you're really if you have these soldiers or whoever, and they're interfacing in their brain with an artificial intelligence like Sydney, like uh, Hal in 2001. I mean, what I'm saying is that once you're in that neural network, of course that's what's going to happen at some point. And once you've gotten to the point where you've advanced to the point where soldiers can use, or anyone can use, these neural links, so that essentially, if you and I were in the same unit, um, you can see what I see, I can see what you see. So we
Hmm.
have real situational awareness, and then we can call up. We can call up information like, if we see something, and we can't an object, and we don't you or I can't identify it. Now we can access uh, a vast amount of computer data that can tell us what it is. And now what happens when we're getting this kind of feedback from a highly sophisticated artificial intelligence? It really becomes it's frightening and fascinating, and there's almost no there's almost, for me, no limit to where my imagination can go, and my imagination tends to take some really dark turns. So,
So where does this play into the future of NetForce now that we have moving target is out? You talk about bioenhanced assassins and kind of this AI. Where does the future of NetForce move from here?
well, I always conceived of the first four books, and then there are two novellas that are part of the the first arc of stories. So I really saw moving target as completing the first NetForce arc, and I had uh, planned to reintroduce a concept called CyberNation, which was really ahead of its time and was part of the original NetForce series. And that essentially is what it sounds like: a nation in cyberspace. And what are the ramifications? What happens when you have a country that has no geographical boundaries? So a person in the United States, and a person in England, and a person in China, and a person in Russia all can decide that they want to be a citizen of CyberNation from where they're physically sitting. And how does Russia, United States, China, and whatever other country, England, how do they feel about this? Probably not too good. How do they feel about CyberNation having its own cryptocurrency, and so on? And what would be the kind of global ramifications between established governments and a government that exists among people in cyberspace? And AI came is an important part of that. I really don't want to say too much about what I want to do with that, but um, again, if you look at what we're talking about, what happens if AI becomes involved? I mean, it's very vague what I'm saying, but
Sure.
I guess, but I guess what I'm thinking is just asking myself, how does artificial intelligence play into that? Um, and what are the it's like when you talk about the internet as a whole, what's the good stuff about it, and what's the bad, what's the flip side, what are the bad things that can happen? Because we can all look we at the internet, and we all know what both are at this point. We know what the downsides are, but at the same time, we know what a magnificent tool it is. And it really is the same thing with AI. So, I mean, even though we've kind of discussed the scary part of it, and it is frightening, I do like to look at the two sides of it. And I think that's something I want to explore a lot more.
So let me see here. So with NetForce, it's kind of you've kind of followed this. cyber storyline a little bit. And like you said, you want to talk about the good. Are there any other projects outside of this that you're working on?
Yeah, they're all classified, but I'm
Okay.
actually I, I I'm developing another novel right now, which is unattached to it, and it's actually a historical thriller. But I'm not going to say too much about it, just so I don't jinx myself. And
Fair
I've
enough.
actually I spent the last. This was an idea that's been on the back burner for quite a few years, and I've just in the last number of months taken a deep breath and started really developing it. So that's what I've been doing for the last 2 3 months, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about that in the not too distant future.
Awesome. Yeah. So before I let you go, and it's been an absolute pleasure. We got to have you back again when you have new books coming out, or you just want to chat about AI. But where can people go to follow you to find out more, kind of keep up on the new releases and kind of your expertise in this cyber and AI field?
I'm on all social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Jerome Author or Jerome Preisler Author, um, Facebook, Instagram. Honestly, I forget my handles, but you can find me. Just do a search. If you look at Linktree, is that it?
Yep.
Um, Anyone who clicks on Linktree, you'll find all my stuff there in one place.
Well, Jerome, it
And
was
it's
an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for the books. I encourage everybody to go out there and get the Net Force series, especially the new book, Moving Target. And like I said, sir, you're welcome on any time to come chat. It was the new release, and it was just this was a blast.
Thank you. This really flew by. It seemed like we were talking 5 minutes. I really
All right.
enjoyed it.